Emily stood at the back of the grand wedding hall, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was adorned with white roses, golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over the guests. Laughter and chatter filled the space as everyone awaited the ceremony to begin. Her mother, Victoria, stood at the altar, radiating happiness in an elegant ivory gown. She had always been a strong woman, raising Emily alone after her first husband's death. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but Emily knew a dark truth that could shatter everything. Her mother's fiancé, Richard, was not who he pretended to be. Emily had her suspicions about Richard from the start. He was charming, almost too perfect, and always had an answer for everything. He showered Victoria with affection, making her believe in love again. But something about him never sat right with Emily. His past was a mystery. His stories never quite added up. A week before the wedding, Emily decided to dig into his history. She searched online, made calls, and even hired a private investigator. The truth she uncovered was worse than she had imagined. Richard had been married before, not just once, but multiple times. Each marriage ended abruptly, with his wives disappearing under suspicious circumstances. There were whispers of fraud, abuse, and even murder, but nothing had ever been proven. He was a ghost, moving from one city to another, changing his name, leaving destruction in his wake. And now he had his sights set on Victoria. Emily tried to warn her mother, but Victoria dismissed her concerns as paranoia. "You're overthinking, sweetheart," she had said with a soft smile. "Richard is a good man. He loves me." But Emily couldn't let this wedding happen. She wouldn't let her mother become another victim. As the music began to play and Victoria walked down the aisle, Emily felt panic rise in her chest. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking words of love and commitment. Emily clenched her fists, knowing she had to act before it was too late. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Emily took a deep breath and stood up. "I do," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to silence the entire hall. Gasps echoed through the room as all eyes turned to her. Victoria's face paled. "Emily, what are you doing?" Emily stepped forward, her hands shaking as she held up the documents she had gathered. "Mom, you can't marry him. He's lying to you." She turned to Richard, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. "Your name isn't Richard Thompson, is it? It's Daniel Harper. Or was it James Weller? How many names have you used, huh?" A murmur spread through the guests. Victoria looked between Emily and Richard, confusion clouding her face. "What is she talking about?" she asked him. Richard let out a forced laugh. "This is ridiculous. Emily, you've always been suspicious of me, but this is too far." "Then explain this." Emily snapped, throwing the documents onto the altar. Marriage certificates, police reports, missing person cases, all linked to you. Victoria hesitated before picking up the papers. As she read, her hands began to tremble. "Richard, is this true?" Richard's face darkened. His charming mask cracked. "You don't believe this, do you?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Emily stepped closer to her mother, standing protectively in front of her. "He's been using women for years, and once he gets what he wants, they disappear." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, Victoria slowly turned to Richard. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. Richard sighed, his expression shifting from fake innocence to cold calculation. "Fine," he muttered. "So what if I had a few wives before you? So what if things didn't work out? You would have been the happiest woman in the world, Victoria. But your daughter just had to ruin it." His voice grew bitter, always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I loved you. I trusted you." Richard scoffed. "That was your mistake." Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Emily turned and saw 2 police officers enter the hall. She had called them earlier, just in case. "That's him," she said, pointing at Richard. "He's wanted in multiple states." Richard's eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but the officers were faster. They grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. "Richard Thompson, if that's even your real name, you're under arrest." Victoria let out a choked sob as she watched the man she had planned to marry be taken away. Guests whispered Shocked and horrified, Emily reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry, Mom," she murmured. Victoria wiped away a tear and looked at Emily, her expression filled with gratitude and heartbreak. "No, sweetheart, I should be thanking you." As the police took Richard away, the wedding guests slowly dispersed. The dream of a perfect wedding had shattered, but in its place, Victoria had something far more precious: the unwavering love of her daughter. And that was something no deceitful man could ever take away. Victoria sat in the empty wedding hall, staring at the scattered flower petals on the floor. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had been a monster hiding in plain sight. She had been so blind, so desperate to find love again after years of loneliness, that she had ignored all the signs. Emily sat beside her, silent but present, her warmth a steady anchor. "Mom," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, "I know this is a lot, but you're safe now. He can't hurt you." Victoria nodded slowly, wiping her tear-streaked face. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped me," she admitted. Emily sighed, looking down at the wedding program still clutched in her hands. "I didn't want to ruin your happiness, Mom, but I couldn't let you walk into a trap." Victoria reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. "You saved me," she whispered. "Again." The weight of everything was too much, and for the first time in years, Victoria broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. Emily wrapped an arm around her, holding her tightly as she cried. After what felt like an eternity, Victoria pulled away and took a deep breath. "I need to be strong," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "I can't let this destroy me." Emily nodded. "And you don't have to do it alone. We'll get through this together." Later that evening, after all the guests had left and the wedding venue was closed, Victoria and Emily returned home. The house felt emptier than before. There were wedding gifts stacked in the living room, cards with congratulations that now felt like cruel jokes. The wedding dress hung limply on the chair, a symbol of what could have been. Victoria walked over to the gifts and, without hesitation, started ripping them open. She tore through the wrapping paper, pulling out expensive china sets, crystal vases, and handwritten notes wishing her a lifetime of happiness. With each gift she unwrapped, her frustration grew. Finally, she grabbed a delicate porcelain teapot and threw it against the wall. It shattered into 100 pieces. Emily flinched but didn't stop her. "Mom." Victoria let out a shaky breath. I feel so stupid. How could I have let this happen?" "You're not stupid," Emily said firmly. "He fooled everyone. He's been doing this for years. But you got lucky. You got out before it was too late." Victoria sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I don't even know who I am anymore. I built my life around the idea of this wedding, of finally being happy again. And now—" Emily sat beside her, pulling her into a hug. "Now we start over. We rebuild, one day at a time." Victoria exhaled slowly. "I think I need help, Em. Therapy, maybe. I can't do this alone." Emily smiled. "That's the smartest thing you've said all day." Victoria let out a weak chuckle, and for the first time, she felt a small spark of hope. In the weeks that followed, Victoria focused on healing. She took Emily's advice and started therapy. The sessions were difficult, forcing her to confront her fears, her insecurities, and the deep loneliness that had made her vulnerable to Richard's lies. But with each session, she felt lighter, stronger. Emily, meanwhile, continued her research on Richard. She wanted to make sure he stayed behind bars. She worked with the police, providing them with everything she had found. It turned out that Richard had multiple warrants under different names. This time, he wasn't going to slip through the cracks. One evening, Victoria was in the kitchen making tea when Emily walked in, a satisfied look on her face. "They denied his bail," she announced. "He's going to prison for a long time." Victoria exhaled in relief. "Good. I don't ever want to hear his name again." Emily hesitated, then sat down at the table. "Mom, there's something else I need to tell you." Victoria frowned. "What is it?" Emily looked down, tracing circles on the wooden surface. Richard wasn't working alone. He had a partner, a woman. She's the one who helped him forward documents and hide his identity. The police are still looking for her. Victoria's stomach twisted. So you're saying he's part of something bigger, Emily admitted. This wasn't just about scamming you. He's been running a con for years, preying on vulnerable women. Victoria shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. I can't believe I almost married that man. Emily reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. But you didn't. And now, we make sure no one else falls for his lies. Victoria nodded. We should help. We should warn other women. Tell our story. Emily's eyes widened. You want to go public with this? Why not? Victoria said, a new fire in her voice. I was embarrassed before, but now I want to fight back. Emily smiled. Then let's do it. Turning pain into power. Victoria and Emily started speaking out. They shared their story on social media, warning others about men like Richard. Their posts went viral, and soon they were being contacted by news outlets, women support groups, and even former victims of Richard's schemes. The more Victoria spoke about it, the more powerful she felt. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Victoria redecorated her home, getting rid of every trace of Richard. She found new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and most importantly, strengthened her bond with Emily. One day, Emily came home to find her mother sitting in the garden, sipping tea and smiling at the sunset. You look happy, Emily noted. Victoria nodded. For the first time in a long time, I am... Emily sat beside her, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. Think you'll ever try dating again? She teased. Victoria chuckled. Maybe, but next time, I'm letting you run a background check first. Emily laughed, and for the first time in months, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Victoria had almost lost herself in the illusion of love. But in the end, she had found something far more valuable. Her strength, her freedom, and the unwavering love of her daughter. As the months turned into a year, Victoria found herself stepping into a new phase of her life, one defined not by heartbreak or fear, but by purpose and resilience. She had spent so long believing that love was the key to happiness, only to realize that true happiness came from within. Emily, always by her side, had been her rock through it all. Their mother-daughter bond had strengthened in ways neither of them could have imagined. One afternoon, as Victoria sat in her sunlit kitchen sipping a cup of tea, Emily came in with an excited grin on her face. Mom, you won't believe this, she said, placing her laptop on the table and turning the screen toward Victoria. There's a producer who wants to make a documentary about Richard and his crimes. They read our story online and think it could help other women avoid men like him. Victoria blinked in surprise. A documentary? She repeated, her voice hesitant. Yeah. Emily nodded enthusiastically. They want to interview you. They think your story could be a wake-up call for so many people. Victoria hesitated. A part of her wanted to move on, to leave Richard and his darkness in the past. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger through this ordeal, knew that if she could save even one woman from making the same mistake, it would be worth it. Okay, she said finally. Let's do it. Facing the world. The documentary became bigger than they had imagined. Victoria's story resonated with women across the country. People reached out, sharing their own experiences of being deceived by charming con artists. Some had barely escaped, while others had lost everything. During filming, Victoria sat in front of the camera, her hands folded in her lap. I used to think I was too smart to be fooled, she admitted. But love makes you blind. It makes you see what you want to see, not what's really there. She paused, looking down at her hands before meeting the camera's gaze again. I ignored the signs. I ignored my daughter's warnings. But I was lucky. Emily saved me before it was too late. Not everyone gets that chance. The documentary aired months later, and the response was overwhelming. Women from around the world sent messages, thanking Victoria for her courage. Some even recognized Richard under different names, confirming that he had scammed women in multiple countries. Emily sat with her mother one evening, reading the flood of messages on her phone. "Mom, you really made a difference," she said softly. "People are listening. They're learning." Victoria exhaled, a proud smile touching her lips. Then it was all worth it. Despite everything, Victoria never let her past define her. She rebuilt her life, started volunteering at organizations that help women recover from abusive relationships, and even wrote a book about her experience. One evening, Emily dragged her to a charity gala. "Come on, Mom," she said, pulling her toward the door. "It's time for you to have some fun." Victoria laughed. "I don't need fun. I need my pajamas and a good book." But Emily wouldn't take no for an answer. At the gala, Victoria found herself deep in conversation with a kind-hearted man named Jonathan. Unlike Richard, he wasn't overly charming or too smooth. He was just real. He listened when she spoke, laughed at her terrible jokes, and didn't try to impress her with grand gestures. As the night went on, he smiled and asked, "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" Victoria hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I'd like that." Emily watched from across the room, smiling to herself. Her mother was finally moving forward, not because she needed a man, but because she had found herself first. Victoria's life wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had survived, she had learned, and most importantly, she had grown. One evening, as she and Emily sat on their porch watching the sunset, Victoria sighed contentedly. "You know," she said, "for a day that started with a ruined wedding, my life turned out pretty amazing." Emily grinned. "That's because you finally listened to me." Victoria laughed, nudging her playfully. "Maybe you do know what you're talking about sometimes." They sat in comfortable silence, the golden light of the setting sun washing over them. Victoria had lost a dream that day in the wedding hall, but in its place, she had gained something far more valuable, a new beginning. And this time, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. Months passed, and Victoria found herself embracing life in a way she never had before. She no longer saw herself as the woman who almost married a fraud, but as someone who had overcome something terrible and come out stronger. She had built a new routine, mornings spent reading on the porch with her coffee, afternoons volunteering at a women's shelter, and evenings enjoying long conversations with Emily about everything and nothing. One afternoon, Emily came home with an envelope in her hands. She placed it on the table, looking at her mother carefully. "It's from the prison," she said. Victoria stared at it, her hand still as she considered whether she wanted to open it. "Richard?" she finally asked. Emily nodded. "Do you want to read it first?" Victoria shook her head. "No. If he has something to say, I want to hear it myself." She picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, the handwriting neat and precise. She took a deep breath and began reading. "Victoria, I don't expect you to forgive me, nor do I think you ever will. But I need you to know that I never intended to hurt you. Maybe that doesn't mean anything now, but I wanted to say it anyway. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I believed in love, when I was honest, when I wasn't the man I am now. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I let my greed, my need for control, consume me. I don't regret getting caught. Maybe this is what I needed all along. Time to sit with my choices, to understand the destruction I've left in my wake. You didn't deserve any of this, and neither did Emily. She's strong, though. You raised her well. If I had someone like her in my life growing up, maybe I would have turned out differently. I know this letter doesn't change anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see everything I've done, and I'm sorry. Richard." Victoria exhaled slowly, setting the letter down. She felt nothing, not anger, not sadness, not relief. It was just words on a page, an attempt at redemption from a man who had spent years manipulating and destroying lives. Emily watched her carefully. "Are you okay?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, I think I am." She took the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it back into the envelope before tossing it into the drawer. It didn't matter what Richard thought now. He was a past, and she was done letting him have any hold over her future. Life continued, and with each passing day, Victoria felt lighter. She met with Jonathan for coffee a few times, though she made sure to take things slow. He was patient with her, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, and she appreciated that. For now, she was content with good company and the simple pleasure of laughter shared over warm drinks. Emily, meanwhile, had taken a job at a local investigative firm, using the skills she had honed during her research on Richard. She found purpose in helping others uncover the truth, ensuring that fewer people would fall victim to the kind of deception her mother had faced. One evening, as Victoria and Emily sat together watching an old movie, Victoria turned to her daughter with a smile. "You know, I used to think I needed someone to complete me. That love was the missing piece of my life. But now I realize I was always whole. I just didn't see it." Emily grinned. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Victoria chuckled. "Yeah, well, some lessons take time." The past would always be a part of her story, but it didn't define her anymore. She had learned, she had healed, and most importantly, she had moved forward. And as she sat beside her daughter, surrounded by love, laughter, and the warmth of a life well lived, she knew one thing for certain. She was finally, truly free. As the weeks passed, Victoria embraced the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. Life no longer felt like a storm she had to survive, but instead, a calm sea she could finally navigate on her own terms. She spent more time gardening, filling her home with fresh flowers and the scent of new beginnings. She found joy in cooking again, experimenting with recipes she had once shared with Emily when she was a child. One evening, as she prepared dinner, the doorbell rang. Wiping her hands on a towel, she made her way to the door and opened it to find Jonathan standing there with a shy smile and a bottle of wine in his hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting him in. "Not at all. I was just making pasta. I hope you like garlic." Jonathan chuckled. "I love it." As they sat at the table, sharing stories and laughter between bites of food, Victoria felt something she hadn't in a long time. Ease. Jonathan was different. He wasn't trying to impress her with grand gestures or sweet-talking his way into her life. He was just present, and that was enough. Over time, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Some days they would meet for coffee. Other times he would join her for a quiet evening of cooking and conversation. He never pressured her for more, never made her feel like she owed him anything. And for that, Victoria was grateful. Meanwhile, Emily was thriving in her new job. She worked on cases that helped families reunite, expose financial frauds, and even assisted in gathering evidence against criminals like Richard. She had turned her pain into purpose. And Victoria couldn't have been prouder. One afternoon, Emily came home with an excited look in her eyes. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she said, dropping her bag onto the couch. "Remember the woman who was helping Richard with his scams? The police finally found her." Victoria's breath caught. Where? She was hiding in another state under a fake identity. Turns out, she had been running her own scams long before Richard came into the picture. She's being extradited to face charges, and the police think she might be connected to an even bigger network of con artists. Victoria exhaled, shaking her head. Unbelievable. It never really ends, does it? Emily sat beside her. "No, but at least we made a difference. If we hadn't spoken out, they might never have connected the dots." Victoria nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. They had fought back. They had won. Months passed, and one day, Victoria found herself standing in front of the mirror, slipping on a navy blue dress. She smoothed the fabric down, staring at her reflection. This wasn't a wedding dress. It wasn't meant for someone else's dream. It was just a simple dress, for a simple evening out with a man who had been patient and kind. Jonathan arrived soon after, offering her his arm as they stepped outside. "Ready?" he asked. Victoria smiled. More than ever. As they walked down the street, hand in hand, Victoria realized something. This wasn't about finding love again. It was about allowing herself to be happy, to trust, to live. She had come a long way from the woman who once stood in that wedding hall. Heartbroken and betrayed, she had found her strength, her voice, and a future she had built with her own hands. And this time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. You said, "Continue." ChatGPT said, The evening air was crisp as Victoria and Jonathan strolled through quiet streets, their steps unhurried, their conversation flowing effortlessly. For the first time in a long time, she felt content, not because of a man by her side, but because she had finally made peace with herself. They arrived at a cozy little restaurant, one Victoria had always meant to visit, but never had the chance. The warm glow of the lights inside cast a golden hue over the sidewalk, and as Jonathan held the door open for her, she stepped inside, inhaling the comforting scent of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces. A friendly waiter led them to a table by the window. Jonathan pulled out her chair before taking his own seat across from her. "I've been meaning to bring you here for a while," he admitted. "Figured tonight was the perfect night." Victoria smiled. "It's lovely." "Thank you." They ordered wine, and as they waited for their meal, Jonathan studied her for a moment before leaning forward. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria met his gaze, nodding. "Do you ever think about what you would say to Richard if you saw him again?" His voice was gentle, not prying, just curious. She considered the question, swirling her wine in her glass. "I used to," she admitted. "For a long time, I rehearsed a million things in my head. Things I wish I had said, things I wish I had done differently. But now, I don't think I'd say anything at all. He doesn't deserve any more space in my life." Jonathan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's a good answer." Their food arrived, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Places they wanted to travel, books they had read, embarrassing childhood stories. Laughter came easily, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Victoria allowed herself to enjoy the moment without fear of what was waiting around the corner. As the night wound down and Jonathan walked her home, they stopped at her doorstep. The soft glow of the porch light cast shadows across his face as he turned to her. "I had a great time tonight," he said, his voice warm. Victoria smiled. "Me too." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I don't want to rush anything, Victoria. I'm happy to take things at your pace. But I do want you to know I care about you, and when you're ready, I'd love to be a part of your life in whatever way you'll have me." A warmth spread through her chest, not the dizzying, overwhelming kind she had once mistaken for love, but something steadier, something real. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "And I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm ready to see where this goes." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently before saying goodnight, and as Victoria stepped inside her home, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the fairy tale she had once dreamed of. It wasn't the whirlwind romance or the dramatic, all-consuming passion she had thought she needed. But it was real, it was honest, and it was hers. Days turned into weeks, and life carried on in its quiet, beautiful way. Victoria continued her work at the women's shelter. Emily thrived in her investigative career, and Jonathan remained a steady presence in their lives. One evening, as Victoria sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Emily beside her, her daughter spoke up. "Mom," Emily said, nudging her playfully, "you seem happy." Victoria turned to her with a soft smile. "I am." Emily grinned. "Took you long enough." Victoria laughed, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, some things are worth waiting for." The sky turned shades of pink and gold, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from the neighbors. Victoria had lost so much, but she had gained even more. She had found strength in heartbreak, courage in the face of betrayal, and love. Not the kind she had once chased, but the kind she had built within herself. And as she sat there, surrounded by warmth and peace, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.